After the fall of European communism in the winter of 1989, the end of the Soviet Union in 1990 and the collapse of Yugoslavia in 1991, the winter of 1992-3 was comparatively quiet in terms of dramatic world-changing events, though the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina could scarcely call it a quiet one, as the complex and brutal three-sided war between Bosnian government forces and the various breakaway areas and their respective Serbian and Croatian parent states continued to rage, with the siege of Sarajevo the focal point for the world at large. A UN resolution in February established a tribunal to investigate war crimes, but the organisation seemed to have neither the will nor the ability to actually stop the fighting. Elsewhere, Ireland held a referendum on its abortion laws, asking voters to approve 3 amendments to the constitution which had arisen from controversial legal cases. The first, that the risk of a mother's suicide should not be considered as a medical reason to allow abortion, was not approved, while the other 2 passed, those being that the courts could not prevent women travelling overseas to procure an abortion, nor could they prevent Irish citizens publishing or distributing information about how to do that. It was still a long way from legalising abortion, but it represented a definite liberalising of attitudes and allowed Irish women to make the short trip across the border into the north or across the Irish Sea to Great Britain for the procedure. Somalia had gradually descended into civil war and then outright anarchy during the last couple of years, with the breakaway state of Somaliland in the north and a proliferation of clan-based or Islamist groups under the control of local warlords. With no functioning national government, the humanitarian situation was becoming dire, and the United Nations UNOSOM mission was getting nowhere. In November 1992, General Aidid, the warlord running Mogadishu, demanded the withdrawal of all UN representatives. In response, the Security Council approved a new mission, UNITAF, using military force to protect aid workers and supplies. With just weeks of his presidency left to run, George Bush immediately committed 25,000 personnel to what the US military called Operation Restore Hope, with a further 12,000 drawn from a variety of nations, including a sizable contingent from India. Back home in Mumbai, though, tempers were flaring between Hindus and Muslims over the latest development in a centuries-old dispute around a particular piece of land in the city of Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh. The site was occupied by a probably 16th century mosque called Babri Masjid, but the Hindus believed that it was the birthplace of the god Rama and that a previous Hindu temple had been destroyed by the Mughals to build the mosque in the first place. Archaeological digs had been frustratingly inconclusive, and a long period of fractious dual use of the building was becoming more and more difficult. In December 1992, a Hindu nationalist organisation, the RSS, organised a rally of 150,000 people, many members of the nationalist group VHP and its political equivalent, the BJP. The crowd grew restless and began to attack the mosque, which eventually resulted in its complete demolition. Muslim outrage was met by a Hindu backlash, and in riots in Mumbai between December and January, an estimated 575 Muslims and 275 Hindus were killed. And on the 1st of January 1993, Czechoslovakia formally ceased to exist, splitting into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Various attempts have been made by the government in Prague over the years to popularise the name Czechia in English, but it's never entirely caught on. The split had been so amicable that it was known as the Velvet Divorce, a reference to its Velvet Revolution of 1989, which proved similarly trouble-free. There was one minor sticking point, though. The agreement specified that neither country could continue using the old Czechoslovak symbols. Slovakia adopted a new flag, but the Czechs never quite found an alternative to the distinctive triangle flag, so they simply kept it. In the world of Formula One, there were 2 main stories developing over the winter as the teams prepared for the new season. The more straightforward one was over what Ayrton Senna would do now McLaren, after being rebuffed by Chrysler, Lamborghini, Renault and Peugeot, were confirmed to be using customer-spec Ford HB engines, which were expected to be down on power compared to the works units in the Benetton cars, never mind the Renault V10s in the all-conquering Williams. Senna went to the US and tested Roger Penske's IndyCar, but while he enjoyed the much less high-tech experience, he decided against making the move. Ron Dennis told Ayrton he was in advanced talks with Mika Hakkinen as a teammate to Michael Andretti, but emphasised that this was a long-term plan and wasn't being done to pressure Senna, who understood entirely. It's all very amicable, but Ayrton kept deferring a decision until he tested the new car and was convinced it was a winner. By the start of March, with the South African Grand Prix just 2 weeks away, Senna still hadn't made up his mind, or at least he hadn't told anyone if he had. Meanwhile, it seemed as though something like the FISA-FOCA war was about to engulf the sport. Bernie Ecclestone was keen to reduce the spiralling costs of F1, and more importantly even out the competition, by restricting the use of the kind of driver aids that had made the FW14B so unbeatable in 1992, and in this he was supported by Flavio Briatore, with whom Ecclestone got on famously, and Luca di Montezemolo among others. A FISA commission had recommended some pretty drastic changes to the regulations for 1994, banning traction control and anti-lock brakes, with active suspension and semi-automatic gearboxes given a stay of execution as they were almost universal now. Live telemetry might also go given the cost of the necessary equipment. Frank Williams and Ron Dennis, however, were implacably opposed, as well they might be. In mid-January it emerged that, thanks to a slight mix-up in the paperwork, Williams hadn't properly submitted their registration for the upcoming season, and Max Mosley indicated that it would require the other teams to unanimously agree that they could take part, and Briatore, as well as Giancarlo Minardi, refused. With Frank Williams looking at going through the European courts, he received another letter from Mosley, telling him that he was minded not to grant Alain Prost a super licence since he'd spent his year off shooting his mouth off about FISA, the FIA, and Max and Bernie personally over their running of F1. Prost was defiant. He'd said what he meant and meant what he said, and if the authorities wanted to gag him, he was done with F1. In reality, there was little chance, with Mansell already gone and Senna quite probably taking at least a sabbatical year, that Bernie would allow Williams and or Prost to be excluded from the championship, given his worries about viewing figures. Most agreed that both issues were intended to put pressure on Williams to agree to a reduction in technical gizmos, which would see the others fall into line. In any case, both matters were due to be decided at the FISA F1 Commission meeting just a week before the South African Grand Prix. The issue of the French Grand Prix and the wider issue of the French ban on tobacco advertising was finally sorted out, though it took Mosley announcing that the race was cancelled to focus everyone's thoughts. The court in Quimper dropped its case against Williams for breaking the law in 1992, so the race was back on, and the French government agreed to set up a fund of some 450 million francs to distribute to motorsport in general to compensate for the lost revenue caused by the ban, which proved to be a lifeline for the Larousse team, which had been staring bankruptcy in the face again. Over at Peugeot, the boss of the sporting division, Jean Todt, was keen to capitalise on the firm's success in sports cars by launching a factory F1 team, which was why he hadn't agreed to let McLaren try out their V10 sports car engine. But 200 million francs was a lot of investment in a global recession, and both potential sponsors and Peugeot's own senior management were sceptical about the potential rewards. In February, Todd announced that the project was 80% financed and ready to roll for 1994, but there was still no sign of an actual car, and the deputy head of Peugeot Sport said that if they hadn't finalised by the end of March, there was no way they could be ready for 94. And Jean Todt had had an offer from Luca Montezemolo to come and run the Ferrari team, a difficult offer to turn down for anyone in the racing business. Back to 1993, and the regulations had been finalised with nothing as major as was being suggested for 94, but a few changes that could be significant. The fuel formula had finally been nailed down, closer to the kind of thing you could buy commercially, and the tyres were now 15 inches all round, with lower durability and more pit stops expected. The cars were narrowed by 15 centimetres, among other small changes to the dimensions allowed to slow them down, but more significantly for cost-cutting reasons and to encourage teams to prioritise reliability, teams would be limited to 7 sets of tyres per driver each weekend and would have to make 12 engine blocks last all year. There were tweaks to the format of the race weekend too, to encourage more TV coverage of free practice, which would now be 90 minutes instead of 150, and qualifying, now 45 minutes instead of an hour per session, with each driver only permitted one car. The spare was only to be used on race day and only for serious problems, not just because the driver liked the feel of it better. Practice sessions, but not the race, would now have a pit lane speed limit of 50 km an hour, 31 miles an hour, due to the number of cars coming and going. The calendar saw the disappearance of the Mexican Grand Prix, which was supposed to have been replaced by an Asian Grand Prix at Autopolis, but that proved a non-starter for a number of mostly financial reasons, So instead, as a bit of an experiment, the European Grand Prix would be held at Donington Park as the third race of the season, while the Spanish and San Marino races switched places, restoring Imola to its traditional spot at the start of the European season, if you didn't count the one off at Donington. And with a number of teams having disappeared, the car numbers were given another reshuffle. The last time the reigning champion had decided not to defend the title was 1974, after Jackie Stewart's retirement, and on that occasion it was decided that car number 1 should be the lead driver of the winning constructor, so Ronnie Peterson of Lotus got it. That, incidentally, was the season when fixed race numbers were introduced, rather than them being allocated on a race-by-race basis. Jackie Stewart's Tyrrell team had come second in the Constructors in 1973, so they got numbers 3 and 4, and since they never won another title, they'd kept them ever since. In 1993, though, it was decided that with no champion driver there could be no car number 1, so Williams were allocated 0 and 2. Normally they'd have done a straight swap with McLaren, but for reasons unknown to me, Benetton instead took 5 and 6, and McLaren 7 and 8, which had been vacated by Brabham. Jordan took over Fonmetal's old numbers of 14 and 15, LaRousse took Benetton's old 19 and 20, and the new Sauber team, as traditional, went on the end as 29 and 30. Incidentally, while we're on numbers, there was one previous occasion in F1 where a car number 0 had appeared. In 1973, apparently a big year in the history of such things, young South African Jody Scheckter had been given a third McLaren at 5 races. With the numbers being allocated on a race-by-race basis, he was number 6 in South Africa, number 8 in France, number 30 in Britain, but for the Canadian and US Grand Prix at the end of the year, and for reasons unknown to me, he was allocated number 0. So, it's time to look in more detail at the teams and drivers lining up in Carlisle in March, so come back for part 2 where I'll do just that.